So most discussions of free will be informed by the neuroscience, and Sam Harris is, of course, he's a neuroscientist. And what they'll point out, rightly, is that they can predict, if they measure your brain activity, in many cases, they can predict dozens of milliseconds before what you're going to do in certain
up to 7 seconds even sometimes.
7 seconds, that's right, exactly right.
That's crazy to think about too. It's like you could measure what decision you're going to make up to 7 seconds before
the person can consciously report that they're going.
That's absurd
to do it.
Oh.
So if you're a neurobiological reductionist, what you would say is this shows that brain activity is responsible for your decisions, and brain activity is responsible for your conscious experiences. And the brain activity is doing both. But space-time is doomed. And neurons don't even exist when they're not perceived. So what's really going on here? So we're probing an interface object, a brain, and getting hints about something in this network of conscious agents outside of space-time. And and the projection of this conscious agent dynamics into space-time, into this particular avatar, Hoffman or whoever it is, the subject in the neuroscience experiment. So first I would disagree with the neuroscientists, and I mean on this particular issue, I guess with Sam, if he thinks that the brain activity is actually causing our behavior. I should ask him if he actually thinks that. I mean, I'd be interested. I mean, I'm good friends, so I should just ask him.
Yeah.
But to the extent that someone thinks that neurons even exist when they're not perceived, I disagree. Neurons do not exist when they're not perceived. Do neurons have any causal powers? No. Zero causal powers, because they don't even exist. So neurons cause none of our brain activity. So what's going on? So neurons cause none of our behavior, and they cause none of our choices. So what's going on there?
On some level they do, or just completely no?
Neurons don't exist.
Okay.
The only time you have a neuron is when someone actually sees a neuron, like through a microscope. Otherwise, there are no neurons. So when you measure neural activity, that measurement occurs, and that exists. So that's the headset thing. This is the VR headset.
Right.
Which
will take some time, especially for viewers that are new to this. It's going to take some time to digest that.
That's right. So if someone says, I don't believe in free will because I think the brain is creating all of our actions, then I say the brain doesn't even exist when it's not perceived. It creates none of your actions. So that can't be the reason why we say that there's no free will. Now, I might still say that Dawn, this avatar, doesn't have free will. But then it would be from a deeper theory in which the one is the only entity that has free will, that's making choices. And among those choices are this avatar that's called Don Hoffman, and what that avatar thinks it's choosing in the moment. One could say there's no free will for the Hoffman avatar because the only free will is in the one. But when I look at our mathematics, it looks like there's a notion of free will in the mathematics, of choice, that goes recursively down the entire network of conscious agents. In some sense, as we group together conscious agents, we get bigger and bigger conscious agents. And at each agent, you can profitably talk about the free will choices of that agent. So we get a mathematically, what we would call a scale-free decomposition of free will choices. So in some sense, you could say, yes, only the one has free will. And yet it's very useful to unpack that. And the mathematics allows us to unpack that into all these little micro free will choices. And from my point of view, maybe they're just as real as the one, and maybe the distinction between is trying to distinguish between them is a mistake. So just to summarize, most people who deny free will say that it's forced. Our behaviors are forced by our brain activity. And I assert that brains don't even exist when they're not observed. So brains cause none of our behavior. And by the way, I'm all for more research for neuroscience. I think that neuroscience is much harder than we thought, and we need more funding for neuroscience because neurons and brains and so forth we thought that was the reality that's driving everything. It's a thin veneer. What we can see in our microscopes of, literally, 86 billion neurons, trillions of synapses in the human brain. As complicated as that is, that's a tiny, thin veneer in our VR headset of a much deeper, more complex, I think, Markovian dynamics. We have to reverse engineer the neural networks to get the much deeper, more complicated Markovian networks of conscious agents that are behind them. So more funding for neuroscience, not less. But I then also say neurons don't even exist when they're not perceived, and they cause none of our behaviors. So you can see when you go down this rabbit hole, everything changes. You have to rethink everything. And that's why it's been a real shock to the system. I mean,
yeah,
real shock in the last, but hey, that's part of the fun of the ride.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's part of being on the pursuit of truth. It's just so interesting to think. I guess there's just no way in our limited intellect that we're going to be able to perceive how the one could have free will. Because the way that we perceive choice is like, okay, we have these options and I'm going to choose this way. But the higher intelligence of like the collective consciousness, I'm just curious how you perceive choice being made at that level. Or could you even come up with a thought around that?
Well, a couple of things. First, in our mathematical models, where we have probability measures, that's where we come up against the limits of our theory. And when we see, so I might come to a choice point in a piece of software, and I can either go here or there, and there's some probability of going there. Or in like quantum theory, when you look at the wave function of a particle, there's certain probability for it being here or there. When you see probabilities, you are face to face with the limits of your knowledge. And there are two kinds of interpretation we give. One is to say it's objective chance, just raw objective chance. And that's typically a physicalist. And the other is, no, there's some kind of free choice that was made. In the case of consciousness, so in my model there are probabilities, and so that's where my model stops. In some sense, that wherever you see a probability, that's where you know your model is saying, I give up. I just have to do a random number generator here. I don't know what's going on, and that's where your theory, in some sense, stops. Free will, maybe. I have this intuition that there is a choice. But the other part of your question was, how can I really understand that? And I think you can't understand it intellectually, in knowledge, but as spiritual tradition would say, you can understand it by being it. You are the one. So when you let go of your knowledge temporarily, you are that, but then when you come back, you can't really put it back into words, or at least the words become, maybe the distinction between free will and no free will then becomes silly.
Yeah.
When you go deeper, in some sense, anything that you can say is perhaps ultimately trivial compared to the reality that you are. But on the other hand, you can know it not intellectually, but by being inside.